was, so you had 100 at Columbia Law School.
Law students and some undergrads, and really committed to drug reform.
Right. It really, I'm happy. I think there's more people committed to that than might on the surface admit it.
Oh, undoubtedly, yes.
That's something we really want to talk about.
Sure.
And law professors and
judges.
And even police people.
Oh, a lot of police.
Yeah. Welcome very, very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Joseph McNamara. And Joseph McNamara is visiting us here in New York, although he's back in his own home turf, and we'll talk about that. But he's currently a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, in Palo Alto, California. And he is the former police chief of the city of San Jose in California. And he was, before that, involved with police activity here in New York City, and as a native New Yorker. And Joseph McNamara, welcome very, very much to the
thank you,
conversation.
Harold.
I wonder if you could, we're going to talk about the situation so far as drugs, from the perspective of somebody who's been on the law enforcement side of things and sees things whole. But I wonder if maybe you could share, would you share a little bit of your own background? Because you're a native New Yorker, I guess.
That's right. In fact, my dad was a New York policeman, my older brother, uncles, lots of cousins, and I served some 17 years on the police force and retired as a deputy inspector.
I see, okay.
And from there I went to be police chief of Kansas City, Missouri, and stayed 3 years, and then became police chief in San Jose.
San Jose is the 11th, I read in the literature, is the 11th largest city in the United States.
Yeah, it's a city of about 900,000, the third largest city in California.
Right, right. And it's right up in that Bay Area, and it's right near Silicon Valley.
Right, it's part of Silicon Valley, so it's the heart of the computer industry.
That's right, and there's a lot going on. You were, if I may, what part of New York were you from? And did you go, you were police for 17 years, did you say? And did you then go on to be a patrolman is one thing, let's just say, for instance, or to work your way up, but then you did go on also, I think, to Harvard, or you did some advanced work, took a PhD, and maybe we could fill in that.
I did work about 10 years in Harlem. Then when I was a lieutenant, the NYPD sent me to Harvard Law School on a research fellowship. I stayed there for 1 year. And then I took a 2-year leave of absence, an educational leave, and I got a doctorate in public administration from Harvard, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the history of criminalizing drugs in the United States and what impact it has had on the nation's police.
That's really interesting to me. I wonder if it could. Were you a patrolman? Were you on the street? You were at the street level, and so up in Harlem and that sort of thing. And you were kind of if I'm not mistaken, you were kind of a tough guy. You were looking at things. Did you look at things differently when you were younger than you've come to do?
Yeah, I think initially in Harlem, we looked at the terrible damage that heroin was doing to that community.
Yeah.
And so we became soldiers in the war on drugs, willing soldiers.
Yeah.
But after a while, we realized that despite all of the arrests that we were making, we had not reduced drug use or drug selling. And I like to tell an anecdote about how my partner and I arrested a heroin addict one day in a tenement building.
This is right here in New York?
Yes.
Yeah,
and,
please do.
And he said, you know, officer, give me a break. I'm just a junkie.
Yeah.
If you let me go, I'll give you a pusher. And my partner, who was senior, made a deal. And we followed this man along Lenox Avenue. It was a warm day. There were hundreds of people on the street.
Right.
And we were in uniform in a marked police car. And just a few feet away from us, he approached one man after another to make a drug deal. The agreement being that once he and the pusher agreed, they'd go into a hallway to exchange the money for drugs. We'd sort of wander in and arrest the pusher and let him go.
This was the deal you'd worked out with?
Right.
And you're in a marked car?
Yes,
in uniform?
yes.
And they're just doing their business, knowing
That's
you're there in view of them?
Yes, in a way, it was quite humiliating
surreal.
because here we had our radios and our red lights and handcuffs. And, but there's a more profound point to it.
Yes.
The fact is that if we hadn't made the agreement, we would not have known these men were doing drugs.
I see.
And that's why the police can't really enforce the drug laws, because it's a consensual transaction.
Yeah.
Unlike crimes like robbery and rape and murder, where there's a victim, there are witnesses, there's physical evidence, the police can be effective in those crimes, but because drug selling and drug use is consensual in nature, the police have no idea of what's going on. And in fact, 1 million or so crimes a day, I'm sure, occur just like that under the noses of police.
And you're not going to have an aggrieved party bringing his righteous indignation
Absolutely
to the officer
not,
of the law,
no.
right?
Both parties value their privacy
Yes.
quite a bit.
Yeah, it makes it difficult. There's so much to talk about. It's such a big issue. It's like a huge issue that confronts all of world society now and so forth. But I wonder if we could back up to your own thing, your own life. You were a willing participant, as you put it, let's say as a relatively young man on the beat and so forth, in the war on drugs. So you were vociferously advancing that way. Did you change your attitude? Were you changing your attitude from experience? And then did you change your attitude to where you wrote your doctoral dissertation on that? Will you already have changed your attitude? And what caused you to change
It's sort of a personal odyssey for me because I felt very sorry for the people we were arresting in Harlem. It didn't do any good. They needed help. They didn't need to be locked up like animals. And also we recognized that we weren't making any difference. And in fact, we probably increased the violence among drug dealers. As we busted one drug dealer, 3 more would try to take his place,
like
and
mushrooms,
they'd shoot each other. So when I got to Harvard Law School, they were doing a research study on the nature of heroin addiction, and I participated in that study and got a different view of drugs than a working police officer's view. And then when I did my doctoral dissertation, I found out many things that I just hadn't known about the history of criminalizing drugs in America.
The thing I wanted to ask you was, had your attitude changed from your experience as a police officer on the street?
Yes.
Or was it changed by your experiences at the university? You learned things that you hadn't known? And maybe it's not fair for me to ask. It's sort of a change. It wasn't probably just black and white change or something.
No, it was a gradual evolution. The police officers get very cynical and skeptical about the drug trade.
I should think so. What a frustrating kind of thing.
They risk their lives.
Sure.
They do wonderful work in many instances, and yet the problem continues or gets worse.
Right.
And so that happened to me and to my partner and to everyone I worked with in Harlem. But then when I began to look at the history of why we criminalized drugs and how it happened, that really changed my mind. When I started my research, the conventional academic wisdom was that the federal government criminalized drugs in 1914, not so long ago, largely because, according to the academics, the lobbying efforts of the police and the medical profession. But I went through the congressional records, and I found that was not true. The lobbying groups that succeeded in getting drugs made into a crime in America, and remember how profound a change this is. This behavior was legal up until December 7th, 1941.
Coca-Cola.
The groups that lobbied for it were religious groups.
Right.
And the Protestant Missionary Societies in China, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and they saw drugs and drug users as evil people.
Yeah, they had a crusading
demonized
attitude.
these people were immoral and so on. But before the law, these people were not criminals, and we looked at them differently. There were people in American society who maybe needed help, but we didn't stigmatize them the way we do today.
What is the experience if we go back to them when drugs were legal? We used to have Coca-Cola. It was made with coca. I mean, But what was the experience we had as a nation when those drugs were legal?
We had a problem.
We had a problem.
There were many opium addicts because every patent medicine included opium, and probably as many as 100,000 addicts of laudanum, which was a mixture of sherry and opium. But no one got too excited about it because we didn't think of the users as criminals, and in fact most of them were housewives.
Grandma's tonic.
That's right.
Yes,
it was nerve medicine for
and
women.
And it worked,
for women.
Yeah.
Well, it made them mellow.
Yes.
But what's interesting is in 1906, as the medical profession was getting concerned about opium addiction, in fact, they caused a good deal of it because they didn't really know how to cure a lot of diseases back in those days, but they sure knew how to make the patient feel good.
Yes.
And they were very unaware of the dangers of addiction. But in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, which required the labeling of all of these medicines. In other words, you tell the consumer what's included. And as a result of that, there was a tremendous drop-off in the use of any patent medicines that had opium. So in other words, you had a citizenry that was informed, educated, and was responsible, and they stopped using these drugs, not because they were going to get thrown in jail, but just because from a public health standpoint, it didn't make any sense to use these substances.
Really, That was the attitude. So one could have faith in the fact that an educated population would go on the right and healthy non-drug course.
Well, I think we've
seen
seen something of the same phenomenon recently in terms of people stopping smoking, people consuming less high cholesterol foods, people, believe it or not, consuming less hard alcohol in favor of wine or beer, all of which occurred without putting anyone in jail and without the government trying to reduce the supply of those products.
It has a certain view of human nature or human, a view of the human psychological processes that one would have in order, one would hope that that is the case. Some people get pretty cynical about the human psychology. And we've got a long history. There have been inebriates that have been used by humanity. Alcohol, I guess, is one of the oldest and so forth. But it's been there for a long time. People want to change their consciousness for reasons other than medical reasons, right?
Every culture in the history of the world has a history of using some mind-altering substances, except the Eskimos. It was too cold for them to grow any.
But that blubber probably does something to your metabolism,
but once alcohol was introduced into their culture, they joined the rest of the human race. Now, I think that you raised a good point that alcohol is a dangerous drug. About 10% of the people who use alcohol get into trouble with it, but 90% do not. And moderate use is apparently beneficial for your health. So I think you come back to the question, the role of government. Is it government's job to put in jail people that make foolish decisions, let's say, or people that don't lead an ideal life? If you think about what we're actually doing, we're locking up some people because they put certain kinds of chemicals into their bloodstream.
Marijuana or something.
That's right.
Yeah, and a lot of them is just nothing but marijuana.
Marijuana is in a lot of ways far less harmless than alcohol. And
harmful, less harmful.
Less harmful, yeah.
Yes, right, yeah.
And a lot of people say that it's a good medicine for certain uses. The Medical Society of Doctors has come to that conclusion. No one has ever died of an overdose death from marijuana. No one has ever committed a murder because they were under the influence of marijuana. Now, you can't say that about alcohol.
Definitely not.
And so you have to question why last year did we in the United States make 700,000 arrests for marijuana? That's a real question.
Clogging the prison system, clogging the incarceration.
And ruining lives.
And ruining real lives of young men,
the human cost of, to the people that are arrested and thrown out of school, have their family life disrupted, have the stigma of being a drug user.
Exactly right. I mean, it's interesting, very interesting, and whether we stick to the, there's so many things we can go into. We have this thing recently. Maybe we'll steer clear of that. I want to come back to you if we could, and we'll get back to that. Is that you were, when you were a policeman and you were a willing participant in the war on drugs, which is the sort of a politicized view of these religiously,
that's right,
strong opinions about the evilness of the drug thing. Were you in that mindset yourself in doing it, or were you just doing what you were told?
I think,
and what I'm trying to get at in a certain sense is Joseph McNamara, who's made this trip to where you're beginning to see things differently. If that isn't maybe a journey or a voyage of understanding that we might want to try, you, and by your example, we might be interested in trying to encourage that become a journey that more and more Americans start thinking about trying to make. And so maybe your experience would be enlightening.
Well, what happens at first, Harold, is that you're trained and conditioned as a police officer to hate junkies, to hate drug users, to view them as the enemy, to view them as predatory criminals.
Well, the preacher man might feel that way about the sinner.
Well,
possibly. I'm saying if there are analogies there.
Another way of looking at it is the religious groups got their version of sin put into the penal code, which is a little bit of conflict with the First Amendment that keeps church and state separate. But as a working policeman, I began to realize that these weren't evil demon people, they were human beings.
That's right.
A lot of them committed a lot of crime, but they did that because the drug was illegal, and to get the money to purchase it, they drifted into a criminal circle, And they did, in fact, create a lot of crime problems, not because of their drug use per se, but because the drug was illegal. Now, many of those people went into methadone treatment programs and stopped committing crime. The government gave them their drug, and methadone is as addictive as heroin.
That's what I understand, yeah.
It really is. It's a synthetic opiate, but it is just as addictive, and yet when it's given to them in a kind of clinic setting along with treatment, they are able to stabilize their lives in many cases. They're still addicted to a drug, but they're able to commit less crime, and it's better for society.
Yeah. Now, back in the days before it was illegal, made illegal, you know, what was it? And let's just say that the economic forces were able to be more reasonable. We have this tremendous markup on it now that it's all illegal, which is part of the equation that we want to discuss. But in the old days, how did it work out then? Were people robbing and stealing in order to get the drugs?
No,
or they didn't need to because they could get them, right?
No one was at all...
Do you understand what I'm getting at? You know?
Yeah, no one was at all concerned about these thousands of housewives who were addicted because they didn't go around
hitting people on the head to get the money.
Prostitution or robbing banks or anything like that. They and they got over their health problem rather quickly once it became... Once it was explained to them that this substance was addictive, most of them just dropped it and didn't want any part of it. And I think that's a basic lesson that we need to accept here, that the public health education campaigns are much more effective than this gross misuse of the police and prison system for the use of certain drugs. You know, it's only a war against certain drugs. It's not a war against all drugs. And unfortunately, it's only a war against certain people. It hits minority and people of color hardest. They are disproportionately arrested and imprisoned, even though most of the drug use, 80% of the drug use is by whites. Non-whites pay the criminal penalty for it.
Well, that's another aspect of what is called racial profiling, which is all too prevalent in our policing in a lot of people's minds, that sort of thing. That, you know, there's so many questions that come into my mind. It's really interesting and so forth. But this question of addiction, you know, we did a program once with Timothy Leary, who was the great advocate of drugs in the 60s and so forth. Interesting fellow in and of himself and so forth. But he said, on the program we did, he was talking about drugs, and he said that there are, if you say, you mentioned 10% with alcohol, people get into become what they call an alcoholic. They have an addictive problem. There's something addictive in their personality or something where 90% of the people can take a couple drinks and handle it pretty well. But there's some who just get carried away with it. And he said that applied to drugs too. I mean, there are some drugs that tend to be addictive, but the vast majority of people can handle even drugs like heroin or cocaine. They can handle it.
Let me distance myself a bit from Timothy Leary.
No, that's quite all right. But no, it's not the Leary, but the idea that some 10% of the human population, he said it went cross-cultural, were addictive personalities, and that 90% were not, and we skew everything. We skew all of our views toward the idea that everybody is in that 10%
We're willing to make everyone a criminal because 10% can't handle a particular substance.
You said it better than I.
The difference with Leary is I don't advocate the use of these substances.
No, I know.
I mean, people should be cautious. All drugs, including aspirin, are potentially dangerous. More people die from aspirin and Tylenol and Advil than all of the illegal drugs combined.
Is that a fact?
That's right.
Really?
Yeah. So every drug has potential danger. You can have an allergic reaction. You can mix it with other drugs, and so on. But the fact is that some 80 million people have tried marijuana in the United States, but we don't have that many heroin addicts. We don't have that many criminals at all, and we have to ask ourselves as a society, how many more millions of people are we willing to lock up? How many more billions of dollars are we willing to spend for a program that hasn't worked since 1914? We have not been successful in preventing the growth of these products in foreign countries or in stopping them from coming to the United States. 90% of the drugs come into this country undetected. So what really is the problem is that there is a demand that millions of Americans are willing to pay billions of dollars for these substances, and as long as that exists, you're going to have this tremendous black market. I like to say, for example, if I could manufacture this pen for $1, and I could sell the same pen for $17,000, all of the cops and armies in the world couldn't stop that kind of business.
Right.
And that's the markup with illegal drugs.
That much?
That much. The raw product in Bolivia, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, any source country
cocaine,
can be marked up as much as 17,000% on the streets of New York or Los Angeles or San Jose.
Well, somebody is obviously going to be going for that when that's the potential reward.
That's true. We are, despite increasing efforts by the United States government, I'd like to give one example. The magnitude of increase is mind-boggling. In 1972, when President Nixon declared war on drugs, the average monthly Social Security check was $177 a month.
Right.
Now, if those benefits had increased at the same rate drug war spending has increased,
drug war spending, all right, yeah.
The average monthly check today would be $30,444 a month.
Staggering.
So we have to ask, well, what did we get for our money? Opium production has doubled in Southeast Asia. Cocaine production is up by 1/3 in Central and South America. Millions of Americans try drugs. The majority of high school students have tried an illegal drug. 85% of seniors in high school say that it is easier to get marijuana than to get beer. That's what we got for our money. An increase in overdose deaths from drugs, an increase in emergency room visits because of drugs. So all of the government propaganda notwithstanding, we are not winning the war on drugs, and we never will win it trying to use criminal prohibition. So I think there are a lot of alternatives that we should look at. The trouble is, we are still captives a century later of the stereotypes that were set by these religious groups that see drugs as evil and drug users as evil, and so you can't get any politician or public figure to have an objective discussion about this because they're afraid they'll be accused of being soft on drugs.
Right.
And so we have a gridlock right now. But I sense in my studies and my contacts with a lot of different groups that the public is really disillusioned with the drug war. I know many police are. They can't speak out publicly.
They can't say it.
But many people that I speak to, Rotary clubs, other people are just horrified at all of the people. We have 1,800,000 people in prison in the United States. We're becoming a penal nation.
Yeah, it's a huge percentage of that has to do with drugs.
That's right, 400,000 for drugs alone.
Okay, yeah, right. That's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that we're up against. What do you say to the people who would say, and we want to build this up? What do you say to the people who say, well, yeah, we've got all this stuff despite the war on drugs, but it'd be a whole lot worse if we hadn't fought the evil devil. Well, the evil demon. We have to. Do you understand? They take that. They say it could be even worse. We'd be.
Well, you see, they're setting up the argument in a way that it can't be evaluated. There's a funny story about a man who walks up and down Fifth Avenue in this striped suit with a big walking stick, and he's doing it for a year. And someone says, "Why in the world are you doing this every day?" And he says, "To ward off tiger attacks." And the guy says, "My goodness, how many tiger attacks have there been on Fifth Avenue?" And he said, but who knows if I hadn't been walking up and down here in this outfit.
Yeah, you see it a little bit like that as far as that argument is concerned. But you've got a lot of people who aren't necessarily religious. I mean, if you're religious and you're fighting the devil and you're really doing it, or you've got, or within a political dynamic, you've got the locus of evil in some other place where you put it. They do that. I can remember back. I'm not sure now. I don't want to go astray here, but that's like an immoral kind of thing, or argument that's being made at a certain level. I can remember, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even you could, when you were in the police force here in New York, that it used to be that people were being put in prison regularly because they were running numbers uptown. And I mean, the people would be saying it is morally wrong to gamble, to be gambling, and we're going to put those suckers in prison because they're running numbers. And now, and it was a moral issue that was presented by the state, and they'd be arguing, and it's probably true that a lot of people are destroyed by gambling. Now the state has taken it over.
That's right.
They're now the pusher man in terms of gambling.
All of the vice laws.
Am I right in that?
You're absolutely right.
And
all of the vice laws have that background to it, and of course the tremendous corruption that was surrounding the numbers. Sure, people were arrested, but it was in collusion with corrupt police. They were given flunkies to arrest, and everyone understood that this had to go on because so many people wanted to play the numbers. And so if you take this paternalistic view, well, we have to protect these poor black people from themselves, and that's why we're doing this. And obviously,
it was moral. It was put a,
yeah,
they would do it in
it's moral, but I think
Yeah.
it's even more than that. It's that these people can't make responsible decisions on their own. We have to sort of take care of them because they're inferior. They're not the same as we are.
Well,
it's
yeah,
very, very patronizing.
Yeah, well, you might get that kind of patronizing attitude toward people, toward just people in general. But the thing I was trying to make is within they changed.
Yeah.
And now the state became, and
That's
they
right.
changed.
And
so
you
I mean, the war on drugs, is it a moral thing basically? Because you
Yes.
got the same kind of corruption. You got corruption. Now you got a
Right.
book coming out, Gangster Cop. I think
Yes.
we want to talk about it.
Right.
But you got the same kind of corruption involving the police, where they're doing payoffs and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's a huge business that involves a whole lot of people on both sides of the legal line.
That's right.
Yeah.
The biggest opponents to any change in the drug laws are the drug cartels and the Drug Enforcement Administration and some of the bad cops. Although, I mean, we have to be very clear that it's a very small number of police officers who engage in the kind of crime that I'm writing my book about.
You
but
said,
they
you
do.
said you said the drug agencies too.
Yes, the federal.
That's a pretty serious
the-
charge. You think the Mr. McCaffrey and those people are in league with the cocaine growers of Colombia?
Well, they're not in league with them, but they're in total agreement with them that they don't want any lessening of the drug laws.
Yeah.
The
right.
people who run the cartels are very wealthy people because we have these silly laws here in the United States,
Right.
and McCaffrey would be the last one to want to change any of those laws.
That's right. And the people who are there, and then there's some police that are involved.
And
The police-
politicians and judges and lawyers and airline people and
Well, we're
military people
Exactly.
and foreign diplomats and
Right.
so on.
Well, we're talking about, maybe you could spell the dimension. I wonder if we could also say, I think at one time you went on to Kansas City, was it after
Yes.
here? And were you considered for police chief here in New York City? Or was
Yes,
it you were in the running
yes.
to be police chief, which is, you're talking now, not only were you a guy on the beat, so you know the reality of that,
Yeah.
but you were also in the upper echelons of this. So
Yes.
you're talking with authority and you've done that. But I wonder, maybe you could share a little bit of that. Maybe your development. And you went from New York and you developed this attitude when you were in New York about the drug thing. We want to talk about drugs.
Yeah,
here.
I think
from
one
the insider of a police
Right. Now-
person who has changed their attitude toward it.
Yeah,
in a
now
certain sense.
one of the things you need to understand that
Yeah.
the police are in an ethical bind, as I was,
Yes.
both as an officer and as a police chief, because we're sworn to uphold the law and
Yes,
to
of
enforce
course.
the law.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean you only enforce the laws that you agree with.
Right.
And also
That's
you're
right.
sworn to follow the leadership of the elected officials,
Right.
all of whom support this drug war and want to be tougher on drugs than anyone else,
Yeah.
because that's how they get elected and
That's right.
reelected.
Yeah. Right to this
you,
day.
So you are limited in what you can do, but I always spoke out and said that we should be emphasizing education and treatment more than arrest. And indeed, the nation's police chiefs have made a statement of the same principles, that we shouldn't try to arrest our way out of this. Despite that, each year there are more and more drug arrests, and the arrest process itself corrupts even the honest police, because you can't really enforce the drug laws under the Bill of Rights. Unlike rape, murder, and robbery,
Yeah.
the police have to find some other way to get at drug use because it's secret and consensual. And what they often do is just search people. Now, under the Fourth Amendment, the police are not allowed to do that without a search warrant. Yet last year, the state and local police in America made 1,400,000 arrests for drug possession, mostly very small amounts, mostly of poor and minority people. And in almost none of those cases did the police have a search warrant. So how do they get the evidence admitted into court? Well, they lie about how they came about it. And they call it, it's become so prevalent, they jokingly call it here in New York City test-a-lying.
Test-a-lying.
In the LAPD, they call it the Liars Club. Now, why would these otherwise honest officers be willing to do that? It's violating their oath to uphold the Constitution. They're actually committing a felony when they do it. Well, because they've been convinced that they're in a holy war. The politicians, with their constant rhetoric about how threatening drugs are to the future of America, how evil they are, how they enslave people, get the police officers to say, well, they want us to stop this and to limit drug use, and this is the only way they can do it, so that's what they want us to do, when in fact I don't think the public knows what the police are doing. There's so much unethical stuff going on in the drug war. Even the example I gave of my partner and myself, if you think back what it was, we let a person go who committed a crime, the heroin addict, to arrest someone who had committed a more serious crime, the drug pusher.
Yeah, you were going to.
And he enticed the pusher into doing this. So there's a whole question of ethics, and that's standard operating procedure in drug enforcement in the United States. And it is so unsavory that at times the agents get evidence against someone so that they're facing a 10 or 15-year sentence, and they tell them you're going to jail unless you trap other people. And people have even trapped members of their own family to avoid jail terms themselves.
That's ugly.
And I think, you know, when you think back of the all of the Ken Starr hearings and so on, and the American public was really disgusted by the methods that Ken Starr was using. But you know how he defended them? He said, we're using traditional law enforcement methods. And unfortunately, it's quite correct that under no president like Clinton have these methods been used more against people in the drug thing of threatening to put someone's mother in jail if they don't cooperate with you.
He did bring that forth, right?
And wiring, Linda Tripp, well, wiring people is standard practice. And it's all very necessary if you're going to make any drug arrest at all, even though despite all the arrests and all the seizures and all the things we've done, the drug problem continues unabated.
Yeah, that's the question we have to address. It's a little bit like McCarthyism in the 450s. You remember McCarthyism? How the country went crazy.
It well.
In that case, it was the communist menace, and so
that's true.
The political thing. But there was an irrationality abroad in the land. I mean, based on fear, based on a lack of understanding. And I don't know if there's an analogy between that and the drugs. It's different. But the drug certainly is a problem.
Well, I think the analogy, let me continue for a moment, because the analogy is very correct. And in fact, people who criticize the drug war are attacked and called legalizers by the establishment and by the government in an effort to discredit them and to tarnish them in the public. And it's very hard to do that to someone who was a policeman for 35 years, as I was.
Exactly.
But in fact,
you're in a good position to make the case.
Well, particularly I come in for a lot of criticism, and I think anyone who wants to criticize this policy has to recognize and be willing to be criticized, but it happens to be that on any number of counts you can challenge the rationalism of what the government has been doing since 1914. They keep constantly trying more of what has not worked, and they show no signs of lessening that, and they have seriously eroded our civil liberties in a war that cannot be won.
Where does that leave? One other thing, when you were talking, if I may bring it up now, or you brought earlier, is that you said a lot of these young lives are ruined. I mean, somebody's got a joint of marijuana or something, and they're incarcerated, then you can lose all kinds of psychological balance in their own life, and they're ruining a lot of lives like that. We just had a thing recently, I don't know, maybe it'll be tie-in, but one of the people running for our presidency, Mr. Bush, was accused, or it has come up, it's floated in the press, it's been in the press, that he had been involved with cocaine. That's the thing that's floated, and that now they're saying, well, we don't want to bring that up because he had a youthful indiscretion or something. In this case, it wasn't. Do you think that's a relevant issue to bring up in terms of our white leadership, that we could bring up youthful indiscretions to where they got away with it, so it's okay, or is it one to bring up, or is there some relevancy in terms of this question?
I think it's very relevant in a sense.
I'm worried particularly about the racial profiling that's going on.
We don't know whether he did or not. I mean,
but should they investigate that?
But it's a very valid point to discuss, because we could say, if he had been arrested, he wouldn't be governor of Texas. He wouldn't have a chance to run for president of the United States.
Right.
And the same is true of Bill Clinton. He tried marijuana. If he had had bad luck to be arrested, he probably could not have had a career.
They both had nice white skin.
And Newt Gingrich. I don't think it necessarily.
No, okay.
Newt Gingrich said that he smoked pot in graduate school. And what I'm saying is that it seemed to be getting caught is the difference, and the penalties today are so severe that a young person's life is ruined. But more than that, we filled up the jails with mothers and fathers overwhelmingly and disproportionately of African Americans and of Latinos. And so there are a whole bunch of children out there in the inner city growing up without their parents because their parents, under this incredible mandatory sentencing that we have, which is so harsh, their parents are in jail not just for a year or two, but for 10, 15, and 20 years just for drug crimes. In fact, you'll get more time for a drug crime than you'll get for murder or for rape or for armed robbery.
It's really off the tracks, isn't it?
And it's a sort of irrationality that has just grown and grown as the politicians have become more and more demagogic about ridding the country of this evil. They're still talking in religious terms about what is essentially a health and social problem. It's not a problem that can be solved by the police. It's not a war that the police started. And I have a lot of sympathy for the police being put into the position that they've been put in, where they really have to violate the law to try and enforce these drug laws, and they're in great physical danger in enforcing the drug laws as well.
Yeah, one wonders where do we go with all of this, you know, because at the same time that this is happening, the drug designers, the biochemists, just as the designers of software and computers are going, Moore's law is going so quickly, and we understand now in a way that even 20 years ago, when you and I were growing, or I was growing up, or 30, we didn't know neurotransmitters, we didn't know brain chemistry, we didn't know these things, we didn't know what we're dealing with. It was just ad-libbing kind of. But now they're coming up with carefully measured and new things and designer things, and they're coming as quickly as Moore's law in terms of drugs are coming, and there are all these things that are out there. And so we have a rendezvous with understanding what are we going to do with all of these things that the biochemists are coming up with that affect consciousness, or you know, we have a rendezvous with understanding.
For example, you could ask why.
Because there seems to be a tremendous appetite for changing or altering your consciousness.
Remember what we're talking about: chemicals, a series of molecules, and there's an enormous similarity with some of the legal drugs and the illegal drugs in terms of their chemical structure. Prozac could easily have been declared by the government to be illegal because it's a very powerful mind-altering substance.
Absolutely.
But it's accepted as medicine.
Why?
Whereas heroin is not.
Okay.
And so all of those politics get mixed into it, and to a great extent it's totally irrational, because you can't get the government to say, we're doing this to protect people's health. If you are, we're having a horrible effect with overdose deaths, with the spread of AIDS through needles that aren't sterile, and with people getting addicted. If you really wanted to save lives, you'd educate people on the safe use of drugs. You can discourage people from using drugs, but then say, if you absolutely insist on it, at least here's the way to do it with minimal impact on your health. Now,
you don't think that's potentially hypocritical? Or,
no, I don't think so. Other countries have succeeded.
Do it, but if you're going to do it, you should use, you know, maybe the larger question is, maybe it's one that isn't well to be addressed because you can get demonized or something. Maybe the question is that there should be more of an attitude toward that these things can be used by free exercising individuals in order to do it. Like the Prozac should be available to people if they want it, and it shouldn't be some moral principle that is put forth by some group who have some agenda in terms of human nature or something they think is right and wrong. Or what are the standards by which they allow Prozac, let's say, or Viagra for that matter. Here you got the biggest drug going with Mr. Dole and so forth. You know, what is the standard or what is the rationale that they will use in order to walk this carefully modulated, you know, moral line about what is right and wrong in terms of substances that affect consciousness when there are so many, and physiological functioning, when there are so many and they're coming out with a dozen a week, new ones. You know, what is the rationale? Do you know?
I can't find, I've studied it all my life, and I can't find any logical basis for the decisions. They were political decisions. We have two plants that grow. One plant kills 500,000 Americans a year. The other plant has never killed anyone. The plant that kills 500,000 Americans a year is not only
Right.
legal, but subsidized. The plant that kills no one is illegal, a Schedule I drug, which means doctors cannot prescribe it for medicine. Now, the voters have spoken out loud and clear in 10 states and the District of Columbia that they want medical marijuana to be available to patients. If people are sick and their doctor thinks this drug helps, the voters do not want the patients to have to be criminals to use this. But the federal government has stopped the implementation of these initiatives by the sheer arrogance and the federal power that they have. Their laws, federal laws, preempt state laws. So in the state of California, under the initiative, it's legal for someone to get marijuana if their doctor says they need it for their health. But if they do, they're a federal criminal and they'll be prosecuted.
Yeah. Well, okay, that may be begging the issue a little bit, and it seems to me, and maybe somewhere it should be brought up or something, because if you got the medical model, if you'd call it the medical model, that there's something wrong with you, that if you take a medicine or a drug, let's just say, then it's going to make you medically right and get you to be normal. But what about that vast area of things where, you know, alcohol, or some of these others I mentioned? You're okay. You don't if you don't have Prozac, you know, or in that case you have a psychiatrist saying this is going to make you normal. It's a medical model. And do you think the medical model is going to be sufficient in order to deal with this question of these drugs? It's the largest business in the world.
That's right.
There seems to be an interest on the part of the folks in terms of investigating these things, and you've got people coming and saying we're going to maintain a medical model. You've got to be sick in order to take something into your body, even though you might want to try something. And aren't we up against some sort of a constitutional question of invasion of individuals, you know, individual liberty of people to be able to do what it is what they want with their body and mind?
I heard someone put it this way, that you're allowed to take a drug to bring you back to feeling normal, but you're not allowed to take a drug that makes you feel better than normal. That's pleasure. Right. And we have this puritanical streak.
Is that what it is then, Joe? It's a puritanical thing?
It goes back to, again, a century ago, to the religious groups who felt that this was sinful conduct. Now, they also felt that consumption of alcohol was, and dancing and smoking cigars and playing pool and a lot of other things.
Pool halls, for that.
That's right. Yeah. And the society, the largest society, rejected that.
Much less blues bars.
To pass the laws against opium and against marijuana, they introduced many racist arguments into Congress, because the Southern congressmen were resistant to giving the federal government all of that power. It was really a radical change in American public policy. We had a very small federal government before the First World War, before the New Deal, and suddenly you're letting them get into law enforcement, which up until then had been just states' rights. And the Southern congressmen were afraid that if you let the federal government in the door, someday they would get voting rights for blacks, which of course is exactly what happened, thank heavens for our country. But to appease the Southern legislators, they introduced this testimony that black men went mad and raped white women. There were white women in yellow opium dens. For marijuana, degenerate Mexicans went crazy and murdered whole families. Stuff that today we would look at as ludicrous and racist was instrumental in passing the laws that criminalized drugs in America.
Reefer madness, they had that.
That's right, reefer madness.
Anslinger and that kind of thing. So they're
37. And yet, marijuana produced 700,000 arrests last year, so we haven't made any progress at all, despite the fact that every study that's been done has recommended that this drug could be used, it could be prescribed, that it's a safe drug, that it's not toxic, and that under the right conditions, there's no difficulty with it. We know, for example, that if someone is a violent alcoholic, it would be much better that they gave up alcohol and smoked pot. Would reduce the homicide rate in America significantly if we could achieve that.
They have that argument that if they, you know, well, if someone were a pure libertarian, they might just say people should be able to have whatever it is they want, and then that's what it used to be in the old days. I mean, there weren't that many. You didn't have the wide panoply of things that have been discovered by the biochemical And now we're coming into genetic engineering.
Yeah.
They're coming, the genome's almost here, so we're getting knowledge of these kind of things. We can tamper or tinker with the genetic makeup of organisms and this sort of thing. So it's a Promethean kind of capability. And do you think that same moral principle will apply to those kind of questions where it's morally wrong to intrude? Because in the drug case, it's morally wrong to have somebody use a substance, a chemical substance, technology, knowledge, if you will, in order to alter their consciousness. It's morally wrong because it's against God's law of nature. And will that apply to genetic engineering and other kinds of things?
I think many religious groups will try to get...
Where does it end?
Will try to get laws enacted that are in accord with their religious views.
Yeah.
I think in the long run they're going to fail. If we take a look years ago when I became a policeman, the police waged the war against homosexuals.
There's another one, yeah.
Constantly were trying to arrest homosexuals. Abortion carried with it, murder, that you were charged with murder.
Yeah.
All of those things changed in ways that at the time didn't seem like it was possible, but gradually the American public opinion came into it and they began to say, well, this was presented as a moral issue, but it's really, we're doing immoral things to try and achieve these objectives, and what people do in the privacy of their own home is their business. Now,
the privacy of their own body and mind.
We don't say that with drugs, but I believe firmly that someday we will. I don't think we should jump into it. I don't think...
Why? Why?
Well, because
should someone jump into it, maybe to set the tone, rather than just reforming?
Well,
is that a politically motivated stance that we take in order? It's not
practical.
It's practical, and
you don't want rock cocaine on the supermarket shelf next to the soap powder and to the diet soda.
What would happen?
I think
if there were.
Well, I think we'd have some problems. I think.
You think? Well, I mean, would we have problems with people if it were just available? I mean, and people could do it. And maybe you know, they used to have a thing. I mean, maybe somebody should just say that take that kind of thing. Though it seems irrational or something to many, because we got a war and there's all this vested in it and so forth. But there's this thing about kids. You know, you give them any food they can eat. And I hope it's right. I'm not sure. And I may be wrong, you know, which would be very embarrassing. But you give kids, and you let them eat whatever they want. You can give them the sugar and the candy and the stuff and everything. And the research was that they pig out on candy and things that they hadn't been able to have or something. They do it for a while, and then pretty soon they're eating celery and they're getting a balanced thing. Just
well, I remember
that's
reading,
a view of human nature.
I think there's been a lot of criticism of that experiment.
Oh, shucks! I shouldn't have brought it up, maybe. But you understand what I'm getting at. If these things were available to people, maybe they would just, and then maybe they would just by their own volition, having done it or something, they would stop doing it if it was available on the shelf.
I think,
or not necessarily on the shelf in the grocery store, but in the pharmacy or something. Or let's just say generally, let them have what it is that they want. You know, as a view. That's one radical stance that legalization would take.
Pure civil libertarian view in that if it's only harming themselves and not harming someone else,
exactly right,
the government has no business there. But
with
I
all
think
these moral precepts.
we've already voted on that in this country, and we recognize that some government oversight is necessary over product inspection and so on. It has to be balanced. It can be too much regulation, but I don't think anyone would really agree that we would want to let, for example, children have easy access to those drugs. I might mention to you one of the interesting things is that children under today's draconian drug laws have access to any drug they want. They tell us over and over. In school they can get any drug they want. In fact, in prisons, people can get drugs. And if we can't keep drugs out of prison, why should we kid ourselves that we can keep it out of the wider society? So I think, again, any number of logical signposts here to say we have to immediately end the rhetoric of the war on drugs and start talking about this as a public policy, health, education issue. There's a lot of alternatives you have. You can start out, for example, by providing sterile needles, so that reduces, not only reduces the spread of HIV infections, but many times seems to reduce heroin use. The Swiss just did an experiment, and they gave 1,000 addicts heroin to take home, and after 3 years they found there were no overdose deaths. The people had stabilized their lives for the most part, and they were committing a lot less crime for the most part.
Right.
And so this makes some sense in terms of some halfway measures. But I think one thing we could do immediately that would make a lot of sense to me would be to decriminalize marijuana, because there's no indication that it's dangerous as the government says it is.
Okay, what stands in the way of our doing that? That's a reasonable,
marijuana
pragmatic.
tax act.
That's a pragmatic thing. That's not going to letting everything be available to everybody, like making that kind of a wide statement. That's one that would be practical and so forth. Now, what gets in the way of that? What is the practical?
In 1937, the federal government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, and that's the first law that outlawed marijuana in the United States. And that and all the subsequent laws that were passed on top of it would have to be amended. Now, you mentioned prohibition of alcohol. One of the differences with that was viewed as so serious an intrusion on personal liberty that it was felt that you had to amend the Constitution for that to be approved.
Interesting.
And then we had to amend it again to get rid of it.
That's right.
But with the Harrison Act and the Marijuana Tax Act, we didn't do that. We just passed it. Also, in Prohibition, we didn't lock up the drinkers. Under this drug prohibition, I think it's sort of the last vestige of legitimizing racism. That
really,
underneath the surface of this, a lot of people feel, well, we have to do that because these are dangerous people. There's no evidence that that's true. All of the evidence indicates to the contrary, and it's a sort of a way that someone can, for example, it's no longer fashionable to be anti-black, to be anti-Latino, and so on, but you can be for the drug war, and it really achieves the same purpose.
But don't you have I mean, the drugs, or the use of drugs, marijuana or others, I don't know, you would know. I mean, it goes right across the line in all social, economic, and white and racial groups and everything, so it's not, it doesn't really make any sense to say it's racially.
It goes across the line, but the people who are penalized are disproportionately people of color. And the stereotype that many Americans have, white Americans, if you talk about a drug addict, the vision of a young black male in tennis shoes who's going to kill you pops into their head. That's the wrong stereotype.
You think that's what happens in people's consciousness?
Wrong.
That's what they have, and that's the fear?
I think for a lot of people, that's the fear. The other thing that legitimately is a lot of parents are concerned that their kids may get involved with drugs. What I say to them is, look, under this draconian system, the drugs are there. If your kids are going to get involved, they're going to get involved. Hopefully they don't, and you do everything you can to love them and to try to talk them out of that kind of conduct until they're old enough to understand what they're doing. But if the worst happens and they do get involved in drugs, would you rather have them get involved in drugs in a therapeutic philosophy or community, or would you rather have them get a mandatory 4 or 5 year jail sentence where they're put in prison and they're assaulted and raped and they come out broken people?
I understand, and what you're saying makes good sense, and I can commend you and the people in the Partnership for Responsible Drug Information and others in taking that view. I just wonder also if you get on that morality thing, it has to do with it affects the state of consciousness that people have.
Yes.
I studied Marshall McLuhan and technology, and when I did that program, if I could, with Timothy Leary way back when, he said there's something going on. Bobby Dillon used to say there's something going on here and we don't know what it is, and Timothy Leary agreed. He said that the drugs, as far as affecting people's lives, was just a tiny little tiny level of frosting on the cake, and what was really affecting it was technology. It was all the technologies that were coming now affecting consciousness and the way it was done. So there are some people who feel the way those people do about drugs, about, let's just say, television. People are watching television. Maybe we should outlaw television because it's affecting the conscience. And then on to the realm of software.
Don't forget obesity. Obesity is the second cause of death in the United States after heart disease, so maybe we should arrest people that have double bacon cheeseburgers who don't exercise enough.
It maybe ties in here, Joseph McCarthy. We could, because it ties in a little bit. Because
don't call me McCarthy. It's
oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. That was really sorry. I'm really sorry of that. But it ties in because we had just done a program with now Dr. Atkins. And Dr. Atkins, it was just going to air a little bit before, you know, when we were doing it with you. But he's saying that he's got a counterintuitive thing that you should go out and eat fat and so forth. You should do it because that's healthy for you and so forth. So you've got, it's counterintuitive, his prescription, and he's out to try and change the dietary habits of what's accepted wisdom and so forth. And he said he's got 40% of the doctors that are sub rosa in agreement with his view. So there's an idea that is different. Now, the established view in terms of our society now is that these drugs are morally terrible. So we got to have this terrible fighting war. There might be something that counterintuitive to what it is they're saying that is really the answer. And I don't know if the drugs might not be included along with all of these mind-altering extensions of our capability and knowledge, including technology and computers and television and electricity and all these things. We've got to come to terms with our own...
There is a similarity in this sense. The government is constantly threatening to start to regulate the internet.
Yes.
Which will kill it. I mean, it just is so contrary to the whole concept of allowing this kind of freedom.
Yeah.
And that's the difficulty with government. Even our own government, which is supposedly freedom-loving democratic republic, has a tendency to accumulate more and more authority, more and more power, always thinking that they're doing it in our behalf.
Right, that can be
the
worst.
But they are bureaucrats, they are politicians, and what they're doing essentially is depriving people of the freedom of choice.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a question that is there, and it's not only. And some people could say it's not only just let's say government bureaucrats. It's a system. And it may be that the system that people are saying, if you could adjust to this system that we have, when in fact the system itself has to, in a certain sense, change to some things, and this drumbeat of the public saying, or in the case of drugs, that you have this incredible market response that people want this stuff, and these people are saying, no, 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 you should not do it. That might be something in a counterintuitive sense there might be, beyond some of the reformist kind of things, it might be that they're trying to tell us something that, and it should be, it's such a big question, it should be open to a lot of different interpretations, other than the set war on drugs, just say no kind of thing. I've only got about a minute left.
Okay, ultimately, it's a very dangerous thing because the government may decide we're not intelligent enough to vote someday, and they have to shape our voting patterns and shape what we can watch on television, what kind of food we can eat, where we go to school, how long we go to school, how much food we can eat, whether we can smoke, and so on. And what do we have left of the magnificent freedom of the United States of America?
Well, this war on drugs is in the minds of many, and I congratulate you and the others that are doing it, particularly from a position of having, you know, an oversight responsibility for both sides of that legal line, as it were, for having done it. And we didn't get a chance, but you're at Stanford. We'll get the address up, phone number where they can reach you. And I really thank you very much for all the work, Joe, and for coming in. It's a pleasure. I'm terribly sorry about slipping with the, it comes so trippingly off the tongue, Joseph McCarthy, but it is, of course, Joseph McNamara, and he was a New Yorker, born and bred. He's at Stanford now, and he's been the police chief at San Jose. A great story. He's in the war against the war on drugs in a certain sense. Your pleasure to have had his perceptions. We invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now. But once again, Joe, thank you very, very much for coming in. We just sort of got started, but let's keep the dialogue going. And there will always be access here for us to be able to talk about these things. Well,
that's great. The program went by so quickly. We had so many things to talk about.
It is, yeah. The Gangster Cop, you got the book just coming out now?
I hope it will come out next year. Yeah.
And we didn't get into some of the dimensions of the corruption that is in the...
We did get into the perjury, but not into the predatory crimes that the cops commit.
Yeah, it's really an ugly scene, isn't it?
It's a horrible...
And we didn't get into the fact that you're a novelist. You write these detective stories and so forth.
Maybe that's just as well.
Well, no. Well, I mean, it's there and it's everything. But this other story, you think the police are beginning to understand and take this view, sort of like the toward this?
No, I think they're resisting. They're in a total state of denial. They're still claiming it's a few rotten apples and that it's an aberration and that they'll put in certain reforms and that will take care of it, when the history shows that that doesn't work.
Yeah. But you don't think there are more people in police work that are understanding that we got to change our attitude toward the war on drugs?
In terms of changing the
and they
war on
can't
drugs.
say it because it's
Yeah,
politically
I think,
incorrect or something, but they
I think,
feel it and
that's
will
what
say
I
it.
do, really. I
Yeah.
try to give them a way of saying it
Yeah.
as a group without having to identify themselves individually, and then I report that out to the media and send copies to politicians.
Right, right.
That gives a politician a chance to suggest some alternatives be studied,
Right.
just be studied,
Uh-huh.
without, if